This is Surfing Through Cinema. I'm your host, Hawaii Harry. Today I will be discussing the history of Universal Pictures for Studio Week. So, I'll be breaking down each decade of the studio. That way we could get a better picture of its impact and how long it's really been around. So I'll start off with the silent era and starting off in the 1910s. So Universal Pictures was founded by Carl Laemmle, Mark Dittenfus, Charles O'Bowman, Adam Kessel, Pat Bowers, William Swanson, David Horsley, Robert H. Cochrane, and Jules Brulator on April 30th, 1912 in New York City. Now, this is during the time when film production was done mainly in New York City because that's where Albert Einstein, Thomas Edison, and all of those scientists were at, creating all these different products that was used in film. And this company was originally called the Universal Film Manufacturing Company and was formed in response to Thomas Edison, who was enacting the Motion Picture Trust, and this required theater owners having to pay him for the use of the Latham loop used for capturing and screening films and many other items that Edison had patented. And this was common during this time period, where theaters and many movie companies were trying to find loopholes around having to use products by Edison. Secondly, Carl Laemmle was made the company president, and he focused the production efforts in Hollywood, following the current trend of movie productions being done in California instead of New York. And again, that was in response of Edison being overbearing and people just getting tired of it, so they moved west to get as far away from him as possible. In March of 1915, Carl Laemmle purchased a 320-acre plot of land and organized Universal City Studios. He opened it to the public as a tourist attraction as well as for film production. He was heavily involved in the production aspect and would even personally finance the films, which put the company close to bankruptcy many times. And he's one of the few people to do that. See, back in those, well, even now a lot of productions still do this, but he would finance a lot of the films, and a lot of them were big risks. Or just the fact that there were 20 or 40 of them a year, it would really hurt the company, especially if they were bombs or flops. Not very wise investment choice. So in the 1920s, during the Jazz era, Lon Chaney, he was a big draw for crowds going to watch Universal films. So he was in films such as The Hunchback of Notre Dame and The Phantom of the Opera. And Lon Chaney was known for his very expressive faces and his very elaborate makeup art and costumes, which separated him from many other vaudeville and other performing actors of that time. And sadly, not a lot of people know about him, considering how he, almost 100 years ago was one of his last films. So it's kind of a tragedy that he's not known as much as he should be, considering the impact he had, especially in the horror film industry. Okay, so that's Lon Chaney. And another aspect, many production decisions were given to Irving Thalberg, who was very efficient at running the studio and gave a really good impression to Mr. Laemmle. He was offered a better position at MGM, and so he left Universal without his classiness, leaving the studio as a second-tier studio for many years afterward. So that's meaning like they made, B movies or just really low quality and not very good pictures. Just because Mr. Laemmle, he wasn't very good at his production choices, so therefore he had to make cheaper films. Universal contracted a lot of young animators to help create cartoons for them. You may have heard of some of these, such as Walt Disney and Ub Iwerks. So they were creators of the cartoon Oswald the Lucky Rabbit, and they were under contract to make them for Universal. A production company headed by Charles Mintz supervised over the cartoons. He even trying to force Disney to accept a lower pay. But Disney refused to this, and thus Mintz took a large amount of Disney animators for his own animation company. So in secret, Walt and Ub created a new character while also fulfilling their contractual agreement. When the contract expired, Disney broke ties with Universal and created cartoons with his new character, Mickey Mouse. So that brings us to the 1930s. So Carl Laemmle Jr., he's made president of the company. Now this is pretty controversial because, Carl Laemmle Sr., he was known for hiring nephews, uncles, cousins to high positions, and that kind of made it seem like he had a bias on who he wanted in charge of things. So a lot of people in the company weren't too happy when Laemmle Jr. was made the president. But he made some updates to bring it up to the times to make it more, trendy. So he bought theaters, he bought into sound production, he helped develop some of the first talkie films for Universal. He also bought Technicolor to be used in their colored films, and their first one was The King of Jazz. His fresh look even helped Universal win an Academy Award for the war epic All Quiet on the Waterfront, thus helping the studio become more prolific. So although Laemmle Jr. was a child of Laemmle Sr., he seemed to be bringing in the company a lot of good new ideas and good ideas of what to do for production. Now, Laemmle Jr. also helped hone in a specific niche that Universal could hit, and that was the monster movies. Some notable ones are Dracula, Frankenstein, and The Mummy. And, when I was younger, I didn't realize how important these films were. I grew up watching Young Frankenstein and some other things, but I never really watched the original Universal films until recently. And I really recommend them for everyone. I really love Dracula. I think that's my favorite one. But they're all good in their own. I love Frankenstein, especially when Professor Frankenstein or Dr. Frankenstein is about to hone in the lightning and strike the monster, make him come to life. It's a really, really amazing film. And The Mummy, classic in its own. The original one, not the Brendan Fraser one or the Tom Cruise one. I really liked that one because it had Boris Karloff. He was also Frankenstein earlier. And he, like Lon Chaney, was very expressive with his emotions. He always wore pretty exquisite and intricate masks. Very, very interesting actor. I really like him as well. So the reign of the Laemmles ended in 1936. The company had decided to borrow money to create a bigger production of a movie called Showboat, which they made earlier in the 20s. And the reason they took a loan is because Laemmle Jr. had very bad spending habits, and this would make investors nervous. So the Standard Capital Company was put in charge of financing the film rather than Laemmle spending the studio money on his own. The production, unfortunately, went way over budget, foreclosing Standard Capital as a investment company, and they seized control of Universal. So as a result, the Laemmles were kicked out of the company that they had founded. Okay, so let's get into the second topic, which I labeled Classical Hollywood, which is from the 1940s until the 1960s. So, after the Laemmles were kicked out, the studio began focusing on B-movie projects and to keep the finances down and the spending down. And because of this, they couldn't afford to have actors to be contracted with them, which was pretty popular during that time, to have an actor sign up with a studio for, let's say, 8 or 10 films. Instead, they would borrow them from other studios and would hire freelance actors to keep in check with spending. They tried as much as possible to keep the production costs down, so this is a pretty cheap period of Universal. The main audience they were targeting were lower to middle class families that had a neighborhood theater, so the films didn't have to be super large in production, which also brought down the quality in their Western and monster movies, which they had been known for. It was one of the last companies to fully integrate Technicolor completely, because they had dabbled with it earlier in the 30s, but they didn't fully adapt it like other studios until they had success with a remake of The Phantom of the Opera and the first Arabian Nights film. So now color was an integral part of Universal's films. By the end of the 1940s, Universal merged with International Pictures and became Universal International. It was decided to reduce the number of films produced each year to cut down on costs. This was done by William Goetz, son-in-law of Louis Mayer, who was the head founder of MGM. Now this led to the distribution of British films in America. Some notable ones are David Lean's Great Expectations and Hamlet, starring Laurence Olivier, both of which are seen as masterworks of cinema. Okay, so the 1950s. Universal was sold to Decca Records in 1952, and production costs were lowered even more, but this didn't cut down on the quality this time. A series of monster and science fiction films were produced by William Alland, such as Creature from the Black Lagoon, It Came from Outer Space, and Tarantula. These are just some of the best ones he produced during this time. So those classic monster movies you always see, like when Lilo and Stitch, I'm pretty sure, had a scene where Stitch is watching a movie and there's a big spider coming out. Pretty sure that's from Tarantula. I'll have to look more into that, but I'm pretty sure it's from Tarantula. Continuing onward, by 1958, Universal was struggling to make money, and they agreed to sell its studio lot to MCA. Now, MCA quickly took over many aspects of the studio, in particular, modernizing it and upgrading it to be up with the times, as it hasn't seen much of a makeover since the Langleys left in the late 30s. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the 1960s. So MCA officially gained ownership over Universal in 1962 and started going by its original name, Universal Pictures, not Universal International. By 1964, Universal became a full-fledged studio with a television division and a motion picture division as well. So this is when Universal started becoming more of an enterprise, more of a bigger company than it had been in the past. And in particular, television, it helped make it become more noticeable in the industry. All right, well, we're going to go on a break real quick. Here's a message from our sponsor. This podcast is brought to you by Anchor. If you haven't heard about Anchor, it's the easiest way to make a podcast. Here's how. It's totally free. There are tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast from your computer and even your cell phone. But that's not all. Anchor distributes your podcast for you so it can be heard on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and many, many more. You could even make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership. Anchor is everything you need to make a complete podcast all in one small place. So go on and download the Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started today. Okay, we're back from our break. So now I want to talk about the new Hollywood era from the 1970s to the 1990s. So starting off with the 1970s, the biggest film Universal released during the time was a little film by an unknown director. His name was Steven Spielberg, and the film he released was Jaws. Now, Jaws, of course, is not really a little film. It became the biggest blockbuster ever, and back in 1975, and it changed forever how movie going was, and well, helped coin the term blockbuster. It was the highest grossing film until Star Wars came along in 1977. Now, I don't know how many of you have ever seen Jaws, but it's really a really masterful made film because unlike other monster movies where you see the monster all the time and it looks really fake and creepy and not really scary, in this film, because they had so many production problems and the monster hardly ever worked, they decided to go with, why don't we just show it from the view of the shark so it's even more terrifying? As they've figured from, like Hitchcock and all the classic suspense film directors, the less you see of the monster, the more terrifying it is. And that really is a true statement. When I was a little kid and saw it for the first time, I was terrified of it. I was scared of any body of water, not just the ocean. I was scared of drinking water, the bathtub, pools. I was scared of a lot of things for a very long time because of this film. So it really did its job. During this decade, Universal focused mainly on television production and would be in connection with NBC as a place for them to film their shows, as a place to distribute their shows, to create their shows. Universal was being used a lot by NBC. And that brings us to the 1980s. So many classic shows for them, such as Different Strokes and The Jeffersons, were all filmed there on Universal's lot. Another important aspect of the 1980s, so E.T., Back to the Future, An American Tail, The Land Before Time, and Field of Dreams. These are all just some of the most notable films during this decade. All of them would be the big moneymakers for Universal, and to this day, they still captivate audiences, inspire people to make movies. For me in particular, I love the Back to the Future movies. I really like the third one, unpopular opinion, but I like all of them, of course. But the storyline is really captivating. I love the humor of it. Doc Brown, he's definitely the comedy relief. The whole dynamic of going to high school with your parents. I really like these films. And it's hard to sit through one of them without having to go and watch the other ones. I always catch myself whenever I watch the first one, I'm like, okay, put in the second one. Okay, now put in the third one. It's a really, really engaging storyline that you want to keep following along. You want to stick with it to the end. And I really hope they don't reboot this one, because I think it's fine the way it is. It's a perfect beginning, middle, and end. That's how a movie series should be. It should end. Okay, so that brings us to the 1990s. So, 1993 saw one of the biggest years for Universal in a very, very long time. And again, by Steven Spielberg. So, that film, of course, was Jurassic Park, which is based on the novel by renowned author Michael Crichton. And this has spawned 5 films in total. And it helps the audience beg the question on, whether we could versus rather if we should. And, I think if the scientists really thought about that, it probably would have turned out, well, not as exciting for the viewers, but probably better for all the people who died during the film. And another thing in the 1990s with MGM and Paramount, Universal helped start up the company DreamWorks back in 1997. So, funny story, I wasn't even born yet. That shows how young I am. So the animated studio from DreamWorks would go on to make films such as The Prince of Egypt, Shrek, Kung Fu Panda, and How to Train Your Dragon. And in particular, I really like, of these ones, The Prince of Egypt. The music of it is phenomenal. Definitely Oscar-worthy. Animation is gorgeous. I kind of feel it's underrated when it comes to animated films, but that could be just my speculation and opinion. I think people need to talk about it more. Maybe it's the fact that it's religious, people don't like to talk about it. But I think you could look past that and appreciate it for the artwork that it really is. So that kind of brings us to the next section, which I call the digital age, from the 2000s to the 2020s. In the 2000s, Matsushita Electronics, which is now known as Panasonic, they briefly owned Universal for about 5 to 6 years, but they sold it to Seagram after many conflicts within the company, particularly with cultural differences. Now, Seagram, they also sold Universal to the French conglomerate Vivendi in June of 2000. Now, in order to pay off their debts, however, Vivendi sold a majority of its stocks to General Electric, owners of NBC, and became a super conglomerate, NBC Universal. So I just think that's kind of interesting how earlier on NBC came to Universal, to use their lots in their studio, and now kind of the reverse. Now Universal was going to NBC. So I think that's kind of how it goes in the industry. So now we're in the 2010s. In 2011, some of the shares for Universal were sold to Comcast, and this was finalized in 2013. This all was done by the approval of the FCC to make sure the companies were in compliance with the no monopoly ruling. So now, the future to the 2020s. Their future plans include more sequels to the Fast and the Furious series, more Minions movies, another Jurassic World film, and more films to be made by DreamWorks Animation. So normally I'd give my opinion on things, but I kind of did throughout it. So just to kind of sum up everything, it's very interesting to see how this company changed over the years, and who knows what the future will hold. Maybe Disney will buy it. Who knows? So next time, I'll be discussing one of the most popular film series there is in honor of Action Week. And this is, of course, MI6's finest agent, James Bond. Till next time, this has been Surfing Through Cinema with Hawaii Harry. Take care. Thank you for listening to Surfing Through Cinema. Make sure to check us out on Facebook at Surfing Through Cinema with Hawaii Harry and on Instagram with Surfing Through Cinema. We also have a website, www.anchor.fm/Surfing Through Cinema, where you can learn more details on upcoming episodes and on past episodes.